The letters still arrive, even now, even after everything I've done to stop them. They always find a way. I've buried them in the scrubland behind the house. I've burnt them in a fireplace. I've tried tearing them up and throwing them into the sea. Once, I even locked them inside a lead box that I had a blacksmith seal for me. It vanished from the shelf the following week. 2 days later, I found a new letter. It was in my pocket, folded into quarters, with my name handwritten on the front, my old name, the one I haven't used since I moved here. You don't have to believe me. I don't expect you to. I wouldn't believe it either if someone told me something like this, but after 6 years I've stopped trying to understand. The truth is, it all started with just one letter, a small unaddressed envelope that appeared amongst the archive boxes at Carstairs Library in Yorkshire. It was my first month as an archivist there. The library was enormous, quiet, and far too old for today's world. The corridors seemed like passages from a time that no longer existed, and that day, someone left an envelope with my name on my desk. No one called me. No one warned me. The envelope was just there. That was it. I thought it was some formal request for digitization or cataloguing, something normal for the role. But when I opened it, there was no technical sheet. It was a long handwritten letter describing in detail the murder of a woman, her name, her clothes, the exact place where she'd be found, and even the time of death. The author didn't say who they were, only described everything as if it were a script. The letter ended with a phrase, "Now you know. What will you do with it?" At the time, I thought it was some sort of morbid prank, something left by a former employee, perhaps a forgotten play, but 3 days later the police found the body of a red-haired woman on the tracks of the disused Brackley Moor station, exactly as described in the letter. That's where it all began, and that's where I made the mistake of not throwing the letter away. I should have ignored it. I should have left that town that very day, but instead I read the next one. When I accepted the position at Carstairs Library, I thought I was starting my life over. It was a rare opportunity, the kind you don't find just by looking, an institution over 300 years old, deep in the English countryside, needing someone to reorganize its historical archives, digitize ancient documents, and handle private donations. For someone like me, quiet, methodical, accustomed to dust and small print, it was almost romantic. The world outside was moving too fast. I needed silence, and Yorkshire offered me exactly that. I rented a cottage a few miles from the town, modest, secluded, with a real fireplace and a wooden fence that creaked in the wind. The village was small, 2 main streets, 3 cafes, a grocer, and a pub that only opened on Friday nights. People spoke little, but they were polite, even smiling. The kind of place where the postman still calls you by name and neighbours actually listen to the radio. The library sat atop a hill, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed older than the books themselves. It was a dark stone building with narrow windows, and inside, the scent of wood, paper, and damp permeated everything. I arrived early every day. Work was my refuge. I catalogued manuscripts, checked systems, prepared boxes for digitization. Sometimes I'd go the entire day without seeing another human being, and that, for me, was a bonus. Over time, I realized no one mentioned the previous librarian. Not the cleaning staff, nor the volunteers who occasionally showed up for events. When I asked, they'd change the subject or pretend not to hear. One older lady even told me that time swallows those who stay too long in there. She chuckled afterwards. I thought it was just British humour. There were small things that bothered me, but I brushed them off. The way the clocks always seemed to be running late. The fact that documents were never where I'd left them. Or that some archive names would appear in the system and then vanish, as if they'd never existed. I attributed it all to the age of the building, the antiquated system, and my own adjustment. After all, everything seemed to work out fine by the end of the day. The sense of strangeness dissolved amidst hot tea and yellowed paper. But the truth was, there was an emptiness inside. Not an emptiness of silence, but of a real absence, as if something important was missing, as if the walls concealed an unnamed absence that felt heavy. The library was too large for the few staff, too quiet even for an isolated place. Some wings were always closed, supposedly for renovations, but I never saw anyone working in them. The routine, despite everything, continued. In the morning, tea, then archives. In the afternoon, digitization. In the evening, a random book and a leisurely dinner. I grew accustomed to the solitude. I liked it. And that's precisely why I didn't perceive the danger when it arrived. Because it arrived slowly, like everything else there. Without a sound, without knocking on the door. It was just an envelope on my desk, one ordinary morning, enveloped by a silence I'd come to consider normal. The morning it all began, it was drizzling. I remember it well because the window pane was fogged up and the sound of the rain on the roof gave me a false sense of security. The library was still empty. I arrived early as always, switched on the lights in the archive section and made my tea. When I sat down at my desk, the envelope was already there. It was white with no sender, no stamp. Simple. It looked like an internal memo. Except no one left correspondence on that floor. Reception was on the ground floor, and I worked 3 floors up in the section reserved for special collections. It was rare for anyone to come up there. I was, in practice, the only one responsible for the library's physical archives. I thought about asking the receptionist, but the envelope was already there before me, and my curiosity was stronger. Inside was a folded sheet, handwritten, neat, firm script, unhurried, an old-fashioned, almost calligraphic hand. The letter described a crime. It didn't use the term murder, nor did it give legal context. It was simply a meticulous account of what was about to happen. The author wrote as if witnessing the scene. It spoke of a woman, red hair, early 30s. It described the floral dress, the steps she took in the rain, the sound of the phantom train on the abandoned tracks of Brackley Moor. It said she would fall, that the impact would be dry, and that no one would find her for 2 days. The letter ended with the phrase that still echoes in my head to this day. Now you know. What will you do with it? For a moment I stood still for a few seconds. The letter trembled slightly between my fingers. Was it a joke? Some kind of literary exercise? A forgotten excerpt from a novel? But why address it to me? Why without context? I put the paper in my drawer. At midday I went down for lunch and discreetly asked the receptionist if anyone had left correspondence for me. She said no, that no one had gone up to that floor since the previous Friday. I returned to my desk, uneasy. I recalled the details of the letter and decided to look for information on my own. I searched for Brackley Moor, a name I didn't know, and discovered it was an old railway station disused for decades and isolated in the middle of nowhere. No recent news, no planned events, nothing. I thought about forgetting the whole thing, but the letter had unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. There was something in the tone, the precision of the words that took my breath away. At the end of the day, I took the envelope home. I left it on the mantelpiece, as if trying to decide what to do. Two days later, I heard the news on the radio. It was early morning and I was making coffee. The radio presenter sounded odd, hesitant. He was talking about a woman's body found in Brackley Moor, red hair, floral dress, death by head trauma, probable fall, no signs of a struggle. I nearly dropped the mug. I picked up the letter and reread every line. It was all there, every damn detail. I stood still for almost an hour, unsure what to think. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd heard the news first and then confused the timings. Maybe I was suggestible. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. But deep down, something in me already knew. I just didn't want to accept it. The following week, another letter arrived. This time it spoke of a man, 39 years old, walking across the stone bridge near Washmere Lake. The letter described his anguish, his weariness, his vacant gaze before he jumped. The text was cold, almost too descriptive, as if written by someone who wasn't judging the act, just narrating with precision. 3 days later, the body was found. Started having trouble sleeping. The library was no longer a refuge, but a place where the next warning might be waiting for me at any moment. I began checking my desk before I even took off my coat. Every morning my hands trembled slightly. I still hadn't told anyone. Part of me still believed I could stop it, that it was only a matter of time until an explanation appeared. But each new letter pushed me further away from reality, and what scared me most was that they were becoming more personal. The letters didn't stop. On the contrary, they started arriving at shorter intervals. The pattern seemed to follow an invisible logic, like a pulse that kept quickening. At first it was one a week, then every 5 days. 3, sometimes 2 on the same day. All followed the same style, exact objective descriptions, but with a subtle touch of judgment, as if the author wasn't just reporting but expecting me to do something. I began keeping them all in a locked box, hidden in the digitization room cupboard. I still hoped that one day I could hand everything over to the police at once, but I didn't know how to explain what I had. The letters had no postmark, no physical proof of origin. They were ordinary sheets of paper, folded into quarters, and each new crime described in them came to pass. I tried to confront reality with logic. I printed old news articles, verified names, searched for connections between the victims. Nothing, no apparent link, different ages, different locations, random occupations. The only common thread was the time between the letters and the murders, always 3 days. I mentioned this vaguely to a police officer as if doing academic research. He listened politely, said that coincidences sometimes seem more important than they are, and that without real proof there wasn't much they could do. It was what I feared. Saying more would be risking my job and perhaps my freedom. After all, I was the only one with advance access to the descriptions of the crimes, the only one with a collection of letters that seemed to predict each one of them. I began to wonder if I wasn't creating it all myself. Was I reading the letters, forgetting and committing the crimes in some dissociative state? I started recording my nights, using a hidden camera in my room, timing my journeys from home to work. I never deviated from the pattern, no absences, no lapses in time, but the doubt remained. And once it entered, it never left. Small things started to go missing in the library. A locked cupboard that appeared unlocked in the morning. An 1892 manuscript that moved shelves on its own. A smell of smoke coming from the closed section where there was no electricity. I wrote everything down. I took photos. I showed them to a colleague who appeared on Fridays, but he just laughed. He said the building was old and did these things. "Perhaps you're hearing the whispers of the collection," he joked, but it wasn't a joke. One morning I arrived and found a letter on the floor of the meeting room. Not on my desk, but on the carpet under the chair where I always sat. How did it get there? The library was locked. I had the only key to the section, and even if someone had got in, why leave the letter on the floor? Why put it there and not anywhere else? It was a stage scene, a message, but for what and from whom? The inconsistencies began to pile up. In one of the digital files I'd scanned myself, there was an image I didn't remember saving. A blurred, black and white photograph of a man standing in front of the library, holding an envelope. His face was partially covered by shadow, but there was something in his posture that reminded me of someone. It took me 2 days to remember, until I realized the coat he was wearing was the same one I wore in winter. Another time, I received an anonymous call on the library phone. When I answered, I only heard a faint breath, nothing else. When I hung up, the phone rang again. I answered, the same breath, third time. Breath followed by a subtle sound, something like paper being folded. When I tried to trace the calls using the reception panel, they weren't in the log. The receptionist swore no one had used the line at that time. The world around me began to fragment. A library volunteer called me Mr. Hastings one day, a name that wasn't mine. When I corrected her, she became confused and said that's what they called him before. Before what? She couldn't explain. She just apologized and left. The next day she didn't show up again. No one spoke about it. One October afternoon I walked through town to clear my head. On the way I saw a mural with old posters. One of them caught my eye. It was for a missing person man, 34 years old, dark eyes, archivist. The date on the poster was 3 years ago. I ran to it, tore off the poster and kept it with me. I tried to find the place it came from, but couldn't. The cafe next door said they'd never seen that mural. An old man across the street said the board was for theatre announcements and no one had used it for years. And at that moment I knew for certain either the world was falling apart around me, or I was the only one who perceived how it truly was. It took me time to accept that I couldn't solve it alone. I tried to list all logical possibilities, that someone was playing a trick on me, that it was an elaborate hoax, that there was a group persecuting me for some unknown reason. Even the hypothesis of losing my sanity seemed more plausible than accepting that all of this was real. I began to investigate the library's own records. I had access to historical archives, local newspapers, microfilms, old crime reports. I scoured decades of information looking for any clue. And I soon noticed something that had escaped me before. This pattern of letters, premonitory, precise, impersonal, wasn't new. I found fragmented mentions in 19th century reports. In 1886, a librarian named Thomas Hargreaves had recorded in his personal diary that he was receiving letters describing accidents before they happened. He cited fires, drownings, suicides. The documents were vague, handwritten and unidentifiable, but the pattern was identical 3 days between the letter and the event. Hargreaves disappeared in 1887. The following year, another employee, this time an assistant, reported in unsent letters that the words were starting to appear in the books. He said he'd read reports and found messages between the lines, names and places he'd never written. He was institutionalized that summer and died 6 months later with no clear diagnosis. And that shook me. These men had gone through exactly what I was going through, and all of them disappeared or died or went mad. Still, part of me felt a strange relief. I wasn't alone. This wasn't an invention of my mind. It was an old story, rooted in that place, perhaps even in that profession. I began to see the library as an organism, not just a building, but a receptacle of forgotten things, of patterns that repeat in silence. With that line of reasoning, I decided to look for larger patterns. I took a map of Yorkshire and marked the locations where the crimes had occurred. I used the details from the letters to get approximate coordinates. It took a while, but when I finished, I froze. The points formed a drawing. Not exactly a recognizable figure, but a shape, an incomplete circle. There was a repetition, a rhythm, as if the murders were following a geometric order. 4 points were missing to close the outline. What if this was some kind of ritual, an invocation? Not in a mystical sense, perhaps, but in the sense of a cycle, a structure that needed to be completed. Each death, a piece, each letter, a summons. The library was the center. The theory seemed absurd, but why would someone write detailed letters about real crimes before they happened? And why did they always come to me? Me, specifically. I started listing more radical hypotheses. What if I was being used by something that understood time differently? What if the letters were written by an entity outside our linear time, a consciousness that merely observes and records? I returned to the archives and, well, found something even stranger. There was this manuscript dated 1794, describing the legend of a being locally known as the Letter Whisperer. According to the text, it was an invisible presence that murmurs the end before the beginning and chooses a human messenger to serve as a link. The account was vague, but it spoke of a library that silently holds the truth of the future and of words that walk before footsteps. Honestly, it was just too much of a coincidence. I started trying to understand who else knew about this. I discreetly asked other staff about Hargreaves, about the assistant from 1887. Everyone evaded the questions. Most had never heard of them, and those who had looked at me as if I'd said something I really shouldn't have. I sent emails to nearby universities, tried to contact scholars of local history, authors of articles on regional folklore. No response came. Some emails bounced back. Others seemed to have been read, but, just ignored. A single historian replied, but his message was strange. He said, "If you have received the letters, you're already in. Stopping now is not an option. document, record everything, but do not try to understand it. That is what it wants." The message was deleted a minute later. I couldn't reply. From then on, the glitches began to infiltrate, well, every aspect of my routine. My photos disappeared from my phone. Some returned later, but with alterations. In one of them, taken in the archives room, there was a figure standing in the corner, dark, diffuse, almost invisible, but definitely present. In another, my expression was wrong. I was smiling, but I didn't remember smiling. It was a smile out of place. I started writing notes to myself. "Today's Tuesday. Your name is still Elliot. You're awake." Simple things, just to maintain my sanity. But sometimes I found the notes with letters swapped, as if another version of me had rewritten them. Rationality was crumbling, but that's what it wanted, wasn't it? To push me little by little, to make me doubt myself. I couldn't give in. Not yet. There was something there, something that needed to be discovered. I felt it with every fiber of my being. And the strangest thing was that I also felt it was waiting, as if it knew that at some point I would become part of the writing too. That morning, I woke up on the library floor. I was lying among cardboard boxes with no memory of how I got there. The lights were off, the door locked from the inside, and my coat was still wet from the previous night's rain. But I didn't remember the rain, nor leaving home. There was a haze in my thoughts, as if the last 12 hours had been carefully erased, not torn out, just gently removed, like a page ripped from an old diary. I slowly got up. My back ached. My hands were stained with ink, not printer or stamp ink, but pen ink, dark blue, deep. It was on my fingers, on my palms, on my sleeves, and all around me. Letters, many of them, scattered on the floor, on tables, spilling from drawers, folded letters, open letters, old and new letters. I recognized the handwriting. It was the same, always the same, and it was mine. Each envelope had my name, and inside the details, the victims' names, the locations, the descriptions, the times, future dates, some that had already passed, others that were yet to come. A sea of potential deaths, all written by a hand I didn't remember moving. I picked up one of the random letters. It described a car accident, a bearded man driving down a foggy road, losing control on a bend. I remembered the news story. It happened 2 weeks earlier, but I hadn't written that. I swore I hadn't. I rushed to my computer. I tried to access the security cameras. Nothing. The system was empty. The video files had vanished. I went back to the archives room. Now it was different. The shelves seemed reorganized. The books were out of order, not alphabetically, not chronologically. When I looked more closely, I realized the titles were organized by dates of assassinations. And beneath each title, an author's name, my name, as if I had written every one of those accounts, as if they were my works. Each murder archived as a publication, each death a chapter. Something inside me broke. I ran downstairs looking for anyone at all, but the building was empty, silent. The windows were dark, as if it were night, even though I had woken up to sunlight. I went to the main door, locked. I locked and unlocked it several times. Nothing. It was as if it was sealed from the inside. I peered through the gaps. Outside, everything was still. No cars, no people, not even wind. A heavy, artificial silence, as if the world outside had been paused. As if only I were running inside a cardboard set. Then I heard it, footsteps coming from upstairs. Slow, regular footsteps. A muffled sound of old shoes on the wooden floorboards. I climbed slowly, compelled by an instinct I didn't understand. The footsteps stopped. Reaching the top step, I saw a childlike figure standing at the end of the corridor. A girl with black hair, pale skin, dark eyes. She held an envelope. She didn't seem frightened, not alive, just dead. It's your turn to write. Her voice didn't match her age. It was older, drier, a voice of old age canned in a young body. She held out the envelope. I didn't want to touch it, but my hand moved on its own. I took the paper. It was blank, but when I opened it, the words began to appear on their own, as if something invisible was writing on the other side. My name. my address, today's date, and the cause of death: mental collapse due to continuous exposure to the truth. I dropped the letter and ran. I didn't know where to. Each room seemed identical to the last. Each corridor repeated itself. It was like walking inside a book that folded its pages as you read. Everything was familiar, but always wrong. When I finally found the emergency staircase, it led up and up and up. It never ended. I don't know how long I was trapped there. Hours? Days? At some point I fell. Or perhaps I passed out. When I woke up, I was outside, lying in the library's front garden, my coat torn and my eyes burning from lack of sleep. The door was open. People were walking along the street as if nothing had happened. The world had returned to normal, but the letter was still in my pocket. After that day, I left the library. I didn't resign. I didn't hand back my keys. I simply walked away. I walked home like a zombie, the letter still in my pocket, and the feeling that the world was watching me from the edges of time. I spent 3 days lying on the sofa with the curtains drawn. The letters stopped. No new ones arrived. For the first time in months, the silence felt real. I thought I had won. I truly believed it was over, that the cycle had closed with me, and that by not reading I had broken the chain. I began to rebuild my routine. I started sleeping more often. I cooked warm meals, read old books that didn't speak of death. Reality seemed more solid. Things had weight again. It was in this time of calm that I realized what had truly happened. The library wasn't the beginning. It was just a station, a point of contact. Whatever was behind the letters, the premonitions, the murders, it wasn't human. It wasn't a person, nor a group, nor a cult. It was a consciousness, something that moved through stories, through records, through narrative patterns that repeat across centuries. A parasite of reality, perhaps. An invisible author that feeds on chronologies, that uses words to shape what is to come. And for that, it needs someone to write. And there lay my biggest suspicion and perhaps my only truth. I was chosen not because I was special, but because I was predictable. My profile, my organized mind, my love for archives, my solitude, everything about me was ideal to serve as an intermediary. I was the kind of man who doesn't question the rules while they're organized. And when they start to fail, he tries to fix them, even when there's no way to. Such a man doesn't resist, he merely records. This thought filled me with dread, but also a kind of peace. For the first time I understood my role. I wasn't the victim, I was the narrator. I always have been, the one who documents, who preserves, who gives form to the cycle. There was only one way out: to break with the function, so I burned everything, the letters, the files, the maps. I deleted digital files, formatted hard drives, destroyed records I had hidden. I burned my coat. I tore up every paper with my name on it, even personal documents. I wanted to erase myself, to disconnect from the function, to become nobody again. And for a while it worked. I moved town, changed my name, cut contact with everything. I started living from temporary jobs in silence. I never stayed too long in one place. I never told anyone. I never wrote about it until now, because this morning a new letter arrived. It was on my bed, even with the windows locked, even with the door closed. Even with no one knowing who I am or where I am. A white envelope, neat handwriting, and this time there was no crime description. Just one sentence. You've started writing again, Elliot. I put the letter in a locked drawer, but I couldn't ignore it. For hours I sat at the table, staring into nothing, trying to understand how it reached me. There was no explanation, no sign of a break-in, no print, just that white envelope waiting, as if it knew I wouldn't resist my curiosity. I tried to go about my day. I went for a walk, bought groceries, chatted with a shop assistant about the weather. Everything seemed normal. But upon returning home, I found a new envelope. This time on my pillow. It was sealed. Nothing written on the outside, no sentence inside, just a blank sheet of paper, as if it were waiting for me to fill it. I didn't sleep that night, nor the following ones. I started hearing noises inside the walls, the sound of something scratching, not from outside, but from within the house's structure. Indistinct voices, as if someone was whispering words before I brought them to conscious thought. Sometimes I see reflections that don't mirror me, my own gestures arriving a second later, my shadow turning its face when my back is to it. I thought it was paranoia, but then I noticed something worse. The letters started arriving at other houses. First, a neighbor commented on a strange letter that appeared on their porch with no sender. Then I heard children talking about envelopes appearing out of nowhere. An old man across the street put up a new post box and the next day destroyed it with an axe. I understood too late. I wasn't the last messenger. I was just the first to write clearly enough to reopen the trail. The words were loose now. The cycle no longer needed me. It had learned to multiply. And all that was left for me was to observe, as I always have. Today I found a new letter on the front door, different from the others. It was thin, with golden edges. In the center, just one sentence, precisely printed. The next one has already begun. The envelope was open, and inside it was this story.